And before we give the floor to our speakers, I would like to let you know that we had some changes in the agenda. Jasil Damon has requested so that they would speak the first because they will need to leave, and Daniela, who will speak online, she will speak after them, after the Jasil Damon. And after every speech, you can ask one or two questions from the audience, and one or two questions from online audience. As a part of RKCOON, UNFCCC, there are commitments for countries that provide country reports, and this year in December, Kazakhstan will present the 8th national statement and annual report. And according to the structure of this report, there are some chapters where the country should demonstrate the trends of greenhouse gas emissions for short-term, medium, and long-term perspective. And we would like to say that as part of the project implementation in Kazakhstan, there is a very good, strong team. Aydin Bakhtalotov, Nurhat, Dauren Zhemabayev, they are part of this team. They started the methodology and the use of macroeconomic models. They started with Markov, and now they work with Times model. These are the mandatory models for country reports preparation. I would like to say that our first speakers are Aydin and Dauren. Dauren will join us shortly. Aydin will join us shortly. Dauren, the floor is yours. Good afternoon, distinguished participants of the conference. Let me show you our results as a part of our preparation of the report of our 8th Kazakhstan statement. We have calculated the trends of greenhouse gas emissions. I have calculated the emissions of the energy sector, and I will share the results with you now. Here in the slide, we see the historical emissions. There are several stages of the historical dynamics. There is a reduction phase after 1990 till 2000, when the economy slowed down, and as a consequence, the emissions dropped. Then there is a restoration of emissions that is related to the economic growth, to the restoration of the economy, and there is a stage of a radical growth. In 2020, we see a small reduction. Well, not even very small, was quite considerable reduction, but this was related to the pandemic. Here you can see the numbers, 351 million tons, 272, which is 77%, is accountable for the energy sector. And this was my part of projecting the emissions for the future periods. To project greenhouse gas emissions of the energy sector, I have used the Times model. Gulmira mentioned that we've been using this for 10 years already. We have used a set of models, and Times is one of them. What this model can give us, it covers actually all the energy system. When I say the energy system, I mean it's not just the energy power production, but actually all economy sectors that involves fuel burning. This is generation, transformation, and use. We have considered the important macroeconomic indicators, the projected economic growth, population growth, product demand growth, and other macroeconomic parameters, and our assumptions, how they will develop dynamically. The results are generated for every 5 years. We can change this period, we can generate it for 10 years, for example, but that depends on the power of the system that allows us to estimate that solution. This is a technical economic model that resolves the linear equations that enables us to get the most optimal energy system. The energy model can give us the amount of emissions and calculate the capacities in each sector and calculate the financing. So that actually can estimate every subsector of the energy sector. This is in a nutshell about the model that we have used. What are the scenarios we have used for the national communication? There is a standard, and we prepared three scenarios. The first is the basic, the current one, then with additional measures, and scenario without measures. That's the scenario that actually excludes all the measures related to greenhouse gas emissions, and we will see what will happen if we don't use these measures. Here you can see what assumptions we have used to do the estimates of the future periods emissions. This is the estimation for till 2035. This is the scenario matrix, and we show what our assumptions were for every scenario and for all the scenarios. For all the scenarios, there was an assumption of a GDP growth forecast according to the social economic forecast of Kazakhstan till 2026. So it was in 2023%, 2025, 6%. The same, we used the assumptions of the population growth, and there will be peak of oil production in 2025, 115 million tons. This is the assumption that we have used, and it was not changed because there is no information. Actually, everybody agrees that possibly this will be like this. Gasification goes according to the gas balance forecast, and there are scenario assumptions. Without measures, it does not contain all these assumptions, and with the current measures, it shows that the part of the electricity generation with gas in 2020 should be 20%, in 2025, 25%. These are the assumptions taken from the concept of transition to green economy. One of the assumptions is also the renewable energy. 2020 is 3%, 2025, 6%, 2030, 15%. Next three measures are related to the scenario with additional measures. The electricity generation on coal will be up to 40% by 2030%, and the nuclear power plant will be introduced with a capacity of 1.2 gigawatts by 2030. Actually, when we were doing these estimates, there were no active discussion of a nuclear power plant, but we can see that actually we have foreseen that there's such scenario, that it is possible. That's why we included this assumption. So we were right on track with our assumptions. Here we can see the emissions of greenhouse gases in 2030 to achieve the NDC. The current measures are not enough. There should be additional measures taken that can ensure reduction of emissions and NDC implementation. Here we can see the carbon tax amount, which assumption was $2 in next year $2, which is 1,000 tons per ton, 1,000 tenge per tons. In 2030, $16. In 2035, $29. These are not quoted sectors. What does it mean? $1 per 1 ton of CO2. It means that if we buy 1 liter of gasoline, $1 is transformed into 1 tenge per 1 liter of gasoline. So if it is in 2035, $29, then it will be 29 tenge of a carbon tax per liter of gasoline. Here, I have shown the power generation sector that causes great interest actually compared to other sectors. And here we show how the emissions will be reduced according to the scenarios and what will be the power generation level by types of fuel. Here we can see that in the scenarios, there is a reduction by 2030 with the current measures and with additional measures. And then there will be a slight growth. This is related to the fact that the economic growth actually increases the emissions more than the additional measures reduce the emissions. So we should say that after 2030, there should be even more additional measures in power generation so that we can stop the emissions growth and then reduce it. But in general, we can say that power generation on coal basis is going down. This is related to the fact that emissions should be reduced, and also the coal power plants will be phased out because we actually calculated how the existing life cycle of coal power plants after it is over, how the existing coal will be reduced. So this is in the model. In the solution, there shouldn't be effect that all coal power plants will disappear. It is not possible realistically. That's why we calculated this way. If the coal reduced, then all other fuels should grow and satisfy the electricity needs. Here we see the estimates till 2035, and we also did such estimates for the strategy of achieving carbon neutrality, and you can read there what will happen after and what measures should be taken in the energy system. There are other sectors are shown and what measures should be taken in these sectors. As Kwanish talked about it, he actually covered all these sectors, so I won't repeat what he said. In a nutshell, this is it about the emissions in the energy system. Thank you. If there are questions, I'm ready to answer them. I suggest we hear the speakers first and then we'll have questions.
Good day, dear participants of the conference. My presentation is related to forecasting emissions of greenhouse gases in agriculture in the use of land use and waste management. As I didn't mention the methodology, we have different scenarios with various measures, with additional measures, without measures. I will not go deeply into details of the methodology. It's mainly based on GEC guidelines. I will move to the results straight away. In agriculture, the results are we have grown emissions in all scenarios without measures, with additional measures, and so on. So in agriculture, emissions are mainly related to the livestock and the number of heads. That relates to the fact that animals in the process of livelihood are producing methane, and this is one of the main sources of greenhouse gases. as the driver is the number of animals, and Kazakh people like meat a lot, and it's less likely that the consumption will be reduced significantly in, for example, 10-15 years. So probably it will be actually growing, which will also lead to the increase of the greenhouse gas emissions. An interesting situation is also developing in the land use and forestry sector. One very interesting problem was revealed because the source of greenhouse gas emissions in the land use sector is the arable lands, and arable lands are currently losing 1% of humus every year. So for your understanding, 1% of humus, which is the fertile layer of soil, which directly impacts yield. So using 1% of humus means losing 1% of yield. And now we see like 30 million tons is imitating this fertile layer of soil. So fertile layer of soil is directly carbon, and carbon emissions is equivalent to CO2 emissions. So it's on the one hand is problem of agriculture and land use, but it's also economic problem in the future if we will not have additional measures. And currently we don't have sufficient number of fertilizers, and also technologies needs to be applied, like crop rotation and other technologies. And data on the humus content are provided by the Ministry of Agriculture, by the agrochemical service. So these data are published, and there are links if you want to get them. And decisions can be made, should be made on a comprehensive basis. So there should be subsidies to support the appropriate level of fertilizers, but also there should be additional measure on introducing maybe carbon tax in agriculture, and with the reduction of humus in land, they have to pay some tax. This is an extreme measure, but it's needed. Other types of lands are mainly absorbing, for example, pastures and forests. And in general, they have high potential, as the territory is 272 hectares and 100 million hectares. And 100 million hectares are now empty land, and they may be appropriate for planting forests, and this can potentially reduce number of greenhouse gases. And for example, planting these territories of the main forests in Kazakhstan can actually absorb all of the carbon produced in Kazakhstan. Going back to arable land, they are now emitting 30 million tons. So this is around 30%. So if Kazakhstan is emitting around 380 million tons, so arable lands is around 30 million tons. It's around 10%. And let's move now to the drivers. I've mentioned already the drivers, the reduction in the level of humus, pastures, and potential absorption by the forests. Let's move to wastes as well. Wastes are also growing, and emissions in the field of wastes are growing. This is related to the growing number of population in Kazakhstan, and the government is currently undertaking measures to incentivize recycling of waste, and also separation of plastic and food waste and paper and so on. But these measures are not very effective because many regions of Kazakhstan are not ready to recycle such high number of separated waste. And also recently it was proposed to build 6 waste incineration plants, but the tender was recalled, and now the whole concept of constructing waste incineration factories was revised because then the utilization comes very expensive. So the general emission from the waste is around 5 million tons, and they will be growing up to 8 million tons to 2035 with the growth of population. And these are drivers and very briefly results. Kazakhstan in these sectors and agriculture, land use, and waste management will be showing growth in emissions of greenhouse gases, and the emissions will be higher than the level of 1990. And in order to reduce the emissions to the levels lower than in 1990, some extraordinary efforts should be taken. And almost all, as I said, scenarios show growth of emissions. But there are some extreme solutions like planting high numbers of forests and providing lands via auction mechanism for investors for growing commercial forests. But for that, we need to first improve our legislation. And humus in arable lands require serious attention, not just from the side of greenhouse gas emissions, but also from the economic and food security. Thank you. That's all from my side. Thank you very much, Dorian and Aydin. And as already said, we can only take 1 or 2 questions from the audience, and online participants can also ask 1 or 2 questions. Are there any questions? Hello, thank you for your report. I have 2 questions. So this program of high number of plants, I've never seen any map where can we plant such trees so that they would actually grow properly. Are there such maps? And what, for example, species of trees we can plant to be effective? That's the first question. And second question is about an MOU that needs to be signed. So it will be signed between European Union and Kazakhstan on construction of the plant to produce green hydrogen. And as far as I know, maybe I'm wrong, but I heard about it, and it will require a lot of water to produce this green hydrogen. And do you calculate, or do you plan to calculate and assess the risks for Kazakhstan, and especially in the Caspian region, or where they're planning to take this water? So can you tell us more, or someone, can you tell us anything about this 2 questions? Yes, thank you for your question. As for the trees and planting forests, I can answer, and about hydrogen, I didn't maybe can answer. So as of today, as for planting trees in Kazakhstan, we have only 1 big program, which was following the speech, the address of Mr. President, Mr. Tokayev, in his address, where he said that we need to plant 2 billion trees, which is from 200 to 400,000 hectares. And how is it going to be planted? Each region will receive their plan, and the local administrations, akimats, will plant these forests. And depending on natural conditions, the species will differ, because in the north, in the south, it will be more saxaul. In the north, it will be some other species. So the plants will be developed in conjunction with the local administrations, with nature reservates, and so on. So building this 50 billion hectares, or 50 million, hectares, is just one of the potential extreme measures. We haven't approved this yet, but it's just a conceptual suggestion, because this can actually significantly help us to change the situation. I hope I answered your question. And as for the hydrogen generation plant, I heard about this project. It's a new initiative, and as far as I know, why they're thinking about Mangostau region is because Caspian Sea is close to it. I know that it's planned to be exported, but I don't know yet anything about calculations and about any assessments, so I cannot give you any details so far. And obviously, this was not taken into our calculations because at that point there were no such plans. Yeah, just today we noted that websites and list of like best available technologies are listed, but now one of these modern topics is green hydrogen. And my question is whether Kazakhstan is ready to adopt such technology, considering all of the risks of that technology, because many people say that this technology means that along with this green hydrogen, producing green hydrogen means consuming a lot of water, which we don't have. I know that MOU is already signed, MOU between Kazakhstan and EU, but who will be calculating these risks? Who is assessing it? Well, I think those who initiated this project, they have probably done some assessments, and we just need to ask them to show it to the public, because I'm sure they did some calculations. So in our model, we do have green hydrogen technologies, but economically they are not rational now. They can be included in our solutions after 2035, 2040, but they are possible to be used if with some external forces they will be promoted and invested, but these are not internal investments of the country. I haven't seen any calculations on that, so I cannot give you any details. Let me add here a little bit. I think this is a very new initiative, and this is the topic which will be further developing and discussed in our upcoming future meetings and seminars and workshops. And we will write down all of the questions, we record them, we will provide the questions to the representatives of the ministry. Sauli unfortunately had to leave due to some urgent tasks, but I believe that this topic will be a topic of our future discussions. Are there any more questions from the audience? Yes, please. Good day, I represent the energy sector. My question, in the frames of this presentation and previous presentation on low carbon development strategy, everywhere you showed that by 2035 we plan to gradually go away from carbon power plants and from coal power plants, and general strategy of energy transition. But you may know that our power stations are part of the critical infrastructure facilities, but this field is too much regulated. All services in this field are very regulated, and I'd like to ask you to comment about the sources of finance figure, but where will we get this financing from? This is a very painful topic for all energy sector representatives. Well, and the strategy, we show not just the general figure, but also a breakdown by investments and explanation and where we take it from. And the majority of investments, those investments that would in any case happen in our economy, they're just redirected from one field to another field. If we wouldn't have decarbonization, these investments will be in the economy, but now we need to use them properly in the decarbonization trend. And there is additional nuance about how is it broken down between who is paying, private sector or public sector. According to our calculations, and the majority, government is investing to the development of infrastructure. so that then private sector can use it, and the total share, 30% of investments in decarbonization is government, and then we have private sector. We do understand that sector of energy production and heat and electricity is too regulated. There are tariffs that are regulated, but that's what we are writing in the strategy, that tariffs should not be just held at one level, but they will gradually grow, but with explanations what happens in a heat sector and electricity sector, and the fact that nothing happened to the tariffs during the 30 years, it's now having its consequences. But it's not right. If you have a certain asset, this asset should be supported, and you should invest into that asset. And our vision and vision of those who were developing this strategy and scenarios is that we have to somehow align our positions. We cannot continue living with the assets, with the same assets for 30 more years. Dear colleagues, we also want to engage online participants. Let's give the floor to our online participants, and I see that there is a hand raised. So can we ask to switch on the microphone for the online participants who wanted to ask a question? Good day, dear colleagues. From Ministry of Agriculture, the Kazakhstan expedition, I'd like to ask how the emissions in agriculture increased. If we compare to 1990, the arable lands had reduced significantly, and the number of animals is also reduced, so we haven't even reached the same number of animals and livestock compared to 1990. But how is the emissions in agriculture growing? Can I try to answer? I will repeat the question to those who didn't hear. So the question was, how come the emissions of CO2 grown in agriculture while the arable lands reduced in their quantities and number of animals reduced? The answer is that the content of humus in our arable lands reduced significantly compared to 1990s. So compared to 1990s, it's like 15% reduction. So if you can imagine, humus is carbon, the layer of this humus is 15 centimeters, and if we multiply it by 15 million hectares and the density of carbon, then we will have huge masses, millions of tons of losses. Then there is a special coefficient to convert carbon to CO2. It's 3.2. We multiply and we get the emissions of CO2 in CO2 equivalents. So soil via photosynthesis is accumulating carbon in soils from the air, and this is roughly the process of accumulating the carbon by plants in the soil. When soil is and there is storage and absorption, but the vice versa process is losing it and its emissions. So the process of losing humus, this is still emissions. This is about first question. And as for second question, yes, indeed, our livestock numbers had not reached the numbers of 1990s, but according to forecasts, by 2035, numbers of animals will go over 1990s, and that's why in our scenario we have increase of the emissions.
Thank you. If there are no online, maybe someone here in the audience can ask the last question, and we'll move forward. Is there a question? My question. You said that one of decarbonization solution is planting trees that would use CO2 from the air and would emit oxygen. But it is also known that in the US, they plan to build a plant on sequestering CO2 from air. This will be like an artificial forest. Speakers, what do you think about building such plants, maybe in big scale, of just taking the CO2 from the air and sequestering it, either use it underground, keep it underground, or use it for production of some products. Well, speaking shortly, I am very positive about it. This is my positive attitude. But let's talk about that. Plants is like a solar panel that accumulates solar energy, uses a photosynthesis process, and uses CO2 from the air and emits oxygen. And this is like a natural solar panel. And I've heard about the idea that in the US, there are different contests held how to absorb CO2 from the air. And there's another idea, for example, to cover the planet with some material that would prevent solar radiation to get into the earth. And so there are many interesting ideas. I just would like to add, it all depends on the economics, whether it will be viable, how much does this technology cost. Planting trees, actually planting a forest, it can cost from $0 to $50 per CO2, per 1 ton of CO2 equivalent. So maximum would be $50 with planting tree. And those solutions that you talk about as the direct absorption of CO2 from the air, that would cost $400 per 1 ton of CO2. So you see what is more viable. It is 8 times more expensive than planting a forest. There are technologies, for example, that can be used in metal processing, and the technology would cost $150 per CO2, 1 ton of CO2. And you also need to keep the CO2 somewhere to keep it safely, not to prevent it of getting into the atmosphere. For example, there are some coal deposits or oil deposits that are already used, and you can use it for injecting CO2, but you need to control it to prevent it of getting again back to the air. So this is all about the economics. What is cheaper? Those things we should use. And the cheapest is the forest growing, forest planting. Thank you. Well, actually, that plant that sells the quotas, and that's how it ensures its economic viability, but it cannot be scaled up on large territories and for the whole of the planet. Thank you very much. Thank you for the questions and answers. I suggest let's move to the next speaker. And before giving the floor, I would like to say that in the Paris Agreement, there is a more active work on expanding transparency. And the Paris Agreement says that the countries, to fulfill their NDC commitments, they should implement their local measures. And in Kazakhstan, from 2013, there is a market mechanism is used as the internal quota trading system. And for a few years, Gilsildamo expert, which is responsible for preparing annual report for greenhouse gas inventory, it conducted a few trainings, and also it improved the local legislation about using the methodology of the emissions estimation. And the good functioning of the local ETS system is one of the mandatory prerequisites for fulfilling Kazakhstan NDCs. The next presentation is about this work of improving this methodology. I would like to give the floor to Gilsildamo representatives. Hello, everyone. Can I have the presentation on the screen, please? Distinguished participants of the Climate Talk Conference, let me greet you and let me tell you about the work that we do related to the greenhouse gas emissions methodology and what we did to improve this methodology. My name is Imane Sekina, and as Gulmira said, Jasil Damu is an operator of the ETS system, and we provide the support to the government agencies of Kazakhstan on implementing the low carbon development strategy. As you know, we have the emissions trading system in Kazakhstan, and enterprises that emit more than 10,000 tons of CO2, they report to the authorized agency in the electronic system, in the ETS system, about their greenhouse gas emissions. And to estimate these emissions, we have national methodologies. According to these methodologies, the enterprises can estimate their emissions. Before, when the system was introduced, we had methodologies based on other methods, and these were methodologies of 2010. They were approved by the Ministry of Ecology Protection, and there were 19 methodologies approved. And all these methodologies on the basis of the methodology of the Intergovernmental Climate Commission. So the coefficients were taken from international methodologies that didn't account for peculiarities of Kazakhstan. And thanks to our cooperation with UNDP, UNDP helped us to develop new methodologies that were approved by the new environmental code that got into force in 2021. The environmental code related to greenhouse gas emissions regulations. What were the novelties? Our NDCs were included into the provisions. This is minus 15% emissions compared to 1990. Then a system of emissions trading system. Then there was also the rules about the electronic reporting from large companies. The system of emissions trading was also improved. And on the basis of all these items, we have developed a new decree. This is number 331 that was introduced last year. Under this decree, there were 7 methodologies developed. And after their approval in 2021 and 2022, the UNDP project was working on improving the implementation of 371. And now there is a new decree of making amendments to the decree 371. This is already being finalized. In the new decree, we have added 3 more methodologies, and in all the existing 7 methodologies, there were adjustments made with the formulas. And the regulated economy sectors, those enterprises that provide the estimations, they have actually agreed on all the methodologies. We held consultations with the government agencies, with the accredited private enterprises, and now they are reviewed by the Ministry of Justice. And we hope that either in December or in January, they will come into force. There are 10 methodologies. I won't talk in details about them, but why they are different from the methodologies of 2010. The new methodologies state that enterprises will need to use their own coefficients that are based on their laboratory data to identify their own coefficients. They need to take their laboratory data and estimate their own coefficient. This will enable us to find out the more exact information about emissions of these enterprises. This will also enable us to do the analysis, because these enterprises, they actually account for 43% of all the national emissions. And one will be able to analyze their data, will be able to propose national indicators that will be valid for Kazakhstan national inventorization, and that will enable us to improve the quality of national inventorization that we submit to UNFCCC in April every year. We plan that these methodologies will be introduced this year or early next year, and in the next 2-3 years we'll do the analysis and will produce our national coefficients that will be much more accurate. Well, as we said before, the major emissions come from fuel burning in different sectors, and Alisher Kasyanov will talk about the methodology related to such emissions. Good afternoon, distinguished participants. Let's talk about the methodology for thermal power plants for stationary sources of fuel burning. Speaking about the methodology, it consists of 3 chapters. The first chapter gives general provisions, some regulatory documents. In chapter 2, there are formulas and methods of estimating emissions for emitters, for enterprises. As was said before, our system of emissions trading, it unites such enterprises that provide their reports. These are 2 types, the subject to quote system and subject to administration. The chapter 2 is focused on the main emitters in the sectors, while the chapter 3, also the annex, there is a simpler methodology for administrative enterprises. They can use not their own data, because we understand that some small boilers, some small thermal power plants that are used in some small cities, it will be hard for them to use their own data. So they can use the data that will be presenting national coefficients that were developed on the basis of analyzing the major enterprises. And this methodology actually that covers CO2 emissions, methane emissions, and nitrogen oxide emissions. Speaking about nitrogen oxide, this methodology provides the data by default from international experts groups. These are the coefficients of nitrogen oxide and methane emissions, depending on the technology, what boilers they use and what fuel they use. For example, speaking about the formulas, they are presented here on the slide. Please see the second part, because the first part, these are the general formulas. Formula 2, this is the main formula that you can see everywhere, but the major difference compared to a older methodology, you can see the difference in Formula 4. This is the calculation of the coefficient. This is what is the content of CO2 in the fuel being burned. Speaking simpler, when you burn this fuel, how much CO2 is emitted. Here's also the QT coefficient presented and sometimes it is presented as a NCD coefficient. And with this coefficient, we are able to transfer the amount of fuel burnt at the manufacturing site and the amount of CO2 in the fuel in terajoules. This is the measurement unit for energy, and it is presented in international methodologies. Formula 5 also has a difference compared to the old methodologies, with one remark. In the old methodologies, there was such formula, but there was also a clause that this calculation of this indicator is not necessary. Now, in this methodology, it is mandatory. The coefficient of fuel oxidation. This is the actual efficiency of the boiler, how much of the burnt burnt carbon still remained in the ashes. So we are pressed for time. Speaking about paragraph 2 of this methodology, the formula for administrative enterprises looks like this. Administrated enterprises, they take the coefficient from the table. They take the coefficients from the tables that will be actually replaced by the country coefficients that we will be able to calculate when we know the content of the carbon in the fuel. So I think this is it enough of the details, because we have no more time left. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ayman and Alisher. Distinguished participants, we are very much behind the schedule. We suggest you ask your questions directly during lunch, and online, please put your questions in the chat, and we'll send your questions to the speakers. We have 2 more speakers. I would like to give the floor to Daniela Carrington, who is the international consultant, and she's got great experience in international negotiations. This year, she was physically present in the COP27 in Egypt. She helped Kazakhstan delegation to work there. For the companies, Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, market and non-market mechanism, that's very important. Let's listen to Daniela, what was able to be done at COP27 and what opportunities Kazakhstan has. Daniela, the floor is
presentation, because I cannot share the screen. Thank you. Let's see now. So, as Galmira said, I'm going to present to you a new market-based mechanisms under the Paris Agreement and the opportunities for Kazakhstan. So why to do carbon emission trading? Because the climate change is a global problem, and it doesn't matter in which place, in which spot on the planet you reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, it affects the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And additionally, you can do this in places where it is much cheaper and much more efficient to reduce these emissions. So practically, it allows the governments to buy emission reductions at a lower price to achieve their international targets. On the other hand, the sellers, they receive financial, technological, social, and other benefits in line with the sustainable development, and mainly by fostering renewable energy. And with this, the overall goal of carbon emission trading is to limit carbon dioxide emissions and raise the ambition to reduce emission and slow down the global warming. Let us recall what kind of market-based or so-called flexible mechanisms were under the Kyoto Protocol. There were 3 mechanisms, practically 2 project-based and 1 government-to-government. So clean development mechanism was the famous one, which was project-based, and the developing countries were reducing emissions and selling those reductions to developed countries in order to meet their targets under the Kyoto Protocol. And the other mechanism, international emission trading, again, government-to-government trading. As you may know, the clean development mechanism has at the end failed, although it was proved that for some time it had economic benefits for developing countries, as well as is considered one of the main tools to transfer technology, clean technology, to developing countries. But due to the economic crisis and financial crisis in developed countries, their demand for emission reductions was lowered. So the price for emission reductions coming from CDM were very low, and practically the mechanism stopped working. So we have a new mechanism under the new mechanisms under the Paris Agreement. This is under Article 6, where it is said that countries may choose to pursue voluntary cooperation in the implementation of their nationally determined contributions. As you know already, these nationally determined contributions are practically the targets, the goals of each government to reduce their emissions. So, but besides emission reductions, in these mechanisms is included adaptation actions as well. So, what are the main principles of this new voluntary cooperation? So, it has to be approved by the government. So it is voluntary, but at the same time, the governments, they have to have in place the mechanism how they are going to approve participation of the country in this international mechanism. So it has to be designed in the country so to enable the race of climate change ambitions and to increase the mitigation efforts and adaptation and to promote sustainable development. On the other hand, it has to ensure environmental integrity. That means that by using this mechanism, countries are not lowering down their efforts, are not lowering down their targets. There are a lot of benefits of participating in this mechanism, besides the raising the global climate ambition, reducing the emissions, but because in it you engage the private sector, and there's a lot of benefits for the private sector, receiving financial support, receiving new technologies, and expertise in new areas. According to AITA, the potential benefits under this Article 6 includes cost saving of $215 billion per year in 2030. But of course, if it is not properly designed and if it is not properly implemented, it may undermine the ambition of the Paris Agreement. And that's why there are very stringent rules under UNFC, under the Paris Agreement, how to implement this mechanism. It's technically complicated. I have to admit it's not easy if you want to participate in it, but it builds on the expertise of the Kyoto Protocol mechanisms. Unfortunately, Kazakhstan was not able to participate under the Kyoto Protocol in the CDM mechanism, but still the expertise is available, and lessons could be learned from CDM. So what are these cooperative approaches? Under the Paris Agreement, we have three mechanisms. Two of them are market-based and one is non-market-based. Article 6.2 talks about the mechanisms where you have internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. This is the name of the emission reductions which are traded. And you have Article 6.4, which is project-based, and the emission reductions from there are called Article 6.4 emission reductions. So this is what is traded from these mechanisms. One is again government to government, and the other is project based. So at the moment, these mechanisms are operationalized under the Paris Agreement because the guidance how to operate the Article 6, paragraph 2 are in place. The rules, modalities, and procedure for the mechanism established under Article 6, para 4, and there is a work program for the non-market-based approach. So what is saying Article 6.2 is saying to us that the parties may engage in this on a voluntary basis in cooperative approaches that involve use of these internationally transferred mitigation outcomes to achieve their nationally determined contributions to promote sustainable development and ensure environmental integrity and transparency. Transparency is very much important because this way everybody can see that you're properly applying the guidance for this mechanism, and there should be a very robust accounting to ensure avoiding of double counting. This means that it cannot be traded twice. This unit cannot be used for two purposes, but just for one thing. Again, the government has to authorize participation in this emissions trading. So let's try to explain it in more simple terms. This mechanism will allow a country that is overachieving its climate pledge, its NDC, to sell any overachievements to a nation that has become short against its own goal. And this overachievement could be in terms of emission cuts, but might also cover other types of targets. For example, some countries have set goals for renewable energy capacity or for its expansion. This is different from the previous mechanism from the Kyoto Protocol, where only one CO2 equivalent, 1 ton of CO2 equivalent was traded, while here it is allowed different units to be traded. So, as I said, there are guidance already developed in place, but what is, with definition, what is exactly ITMO? It has to be real reduction, it has to be verified, it has to be additional, meaning that it should not be used business as usual. You have to put additional efforts to achieve it. Would be emission reduction or removals of emissions, and could be measured in different measures. But what is important to know that in order to be eligible to participate, of course, you have to be party to the Paris Agreement, to ratify the Paris Agreement, but you have to prepare, communicate, and maintain your NDC. If you don't submit on time or your NDC is not up to the standard, you won't be eligible to participate in this emission trading. So you have to have all the arrangements in place to authorize the use of these ITMOs and to track them, to have the registry, proper system where all these units will be registered, and to have your most recent national inventory report. You have to prove that this contributes to the implementation of the NDC and the long-term low emission development strategies and the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement. So unless you fulfill this eligibility criteria, you won't be able to participate. I'll talk a little bit later about the corresponding adjustment. And of course, a lot of reporting is involved if you are part of this to the UNFC. And UNFC will review if your activities are inconsistency. Okay. So I want to draw your attention to this corresponding adjustment. So on the upper left corner, you can see what I was explaining to you. In the circle, imagine the circle is the target of the country, it's the NDC. This is the amount of emissions the country is allowed to have. So the first country has a leftover of these emission reductions for sale, and the second country has an excess. It went beyond the borders of NDC. So one country is giving money and the other is transferring the emission reductions or the so-called internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. But how it will be reflected in the inventory and the goal in the NDC of the country if the emission reductions come from the NDC. Here in this graph, you can see a country which has low actual reported emissions and it has a lot of emission reductions and decides to transfer 30 units of these ITMOS to another country. So the other country takes this ITMOS and you can see the adjustments. So from the actual reported emissions, you add the 30 units of ITMOS and then the first country has adjusted emissions of 80 units. While the second country, after buying this ITMOS, is deducting this from the actual reported emissions of 100 units and now it is okay with its emissions. Its adjusted emissions are 70 units. So the next mechanism is under Article 6.4 and as I said, it's project-based, and in this case, this mechanism is supervised by a body which is under the Paris Agreement. So again, this aim of the mechanism is to promote the mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions while fostering sustainable development, to increase participation of public and private entities which have to be authorized by the government, and to contribute to the reduction of emission levels in the host country, or they can also be used by another party to fulfill its nationally determined contribution. In other means, it could be they could be sold as well. There is something here which is called overall mitigation in global emissions, because many countries were saying that emission trading at the end of the day is not that good for the atmosphere, so they decided to remove certain part of these emissions, these units, and to cancel them in a special account. So generally this is called sustainable development mechanism, and it will create a new international carbon market which will be governed by the UN body. The emissions reductions will be traded, which are created anywhere in the world by public or private sector. These credits could be generated by, for example, by a new renewable energy plant, an emission saving factory upgrade, or the restoration of an area forest. So this mechanism is going to replace the CDM, which was before operating under the Kyoto. The rules and procedures are adopted for it. Again, their eligibility criteria, as I said, you need to have your NDC properly developed, submitted. You have to designate a national authority for approval of such project, and you have to submit the information to this supervisory body of this mechanism, how this mechanism is contributing to the sustainable development, in particular the sustainable development goals of your country. You have to indicate publicly the types of activities and how these types of activities would contribute to achievement of the NDC or the long-term low greenhouse gas emission development strategy, and to the long terms of the Paris Agreement. I will not speak about the third non-market-based mechanism, which is basically countries exchanging experiences how to, in a better way, achieve their NDCs, and you have different workshops, different platforms, different cooperation, but it's not a market-based. So I'll talk only about the market-based mechanisms, what happened at COP27. An important Article 6 implementation partnership was launched by Japan, the Ministry of Environment of Japan, which aims to advance the implementation of high-integrity carbon markets through the coordination of international capacity building efforts around the world, and will also serve as information platform for Article 6 implementation and provide the support required to pilot Article 6 initiatives. By the way, Japan already has signed a memorandum of understanding with Moldova and Azerbaijan to help them to pilot Article 6 projects. So at COP27, the Article 6 was further operationalized. Some more details on the reporting and how some units from CDM will be transferred to the Paris Agreement and this implementation and so on, but still there are few minor details to be finalized at COP28, and especially forest-based mitigation, which appeared to be a little bit more complicated. As you know, it has always been the case that units coming out from the forests are more difficult to estimate. There are a few more reporting formats, features for the registry, methodologies, and so on. But the University Secretariat will provide capacity building program. So preparation to participate in Article 6 activities should start now, immediately. I must say that many countries who want to participate, many developing countries started to prepare, and there is already statistic that almost 40% of them are putting in place the necessary structures. But it's very much important to understand well the rules established under the UNFC, the Paris Agreement, because these are hundreds of pages of very technical text, which really has to be understood very well in order to be able to implement these mechanisms. Another important thing is to study the potential of the country to participate in these mechanisms and decide in which mechanism you want to participate, which one of both or in both of them to participate, depending on the implementation, of course, of your NDC. For the project-based mechanism, the sustainable development mechanism, it will be good to identify possible projects. You must nominate a national focal point on Article 6. You have to work with possible stakeholders to identify them and to involve them and to educate them. You have to build a national system to participate in this mechanism, including a registry, a national committee for approval of the activities, designated national authority. You have to have legislation in place, build capacity, and so on. You have to learn from the expertise of CDM, although you were not part of it, but still many of the methodologies, many of the features of the CDM will be applied to the new mechanism. Of course, you have to build expertise and participate in trainings, workshops, including those provided by UNFC. It will be good to join this Japanese implementation partnership, because Japan is expected to be amongst the buyers of such emission reductions, and it will be good at an early point to identify possible buyers interested to buy emission reductions from Kazakhstan and sign memorandum of understanding with them. So I try to be very brief. I know it's very complicated, but if you have any questions, I will be happy to answer later on.
Thank you very much, Daniela, for this very interesting presentation. It's really hard to cover everything because there are a lot of information of implementing market mechanisms. But I think we've heard the main messages for the private sector and for decision makers. And the Kazakhstan NDC actually states that Kazakhstan can participate in these international mechanisms. And the condition for participation is a timely presentation of Kazakhstan NDC. UNFCCC decision actually states that second, third NDC should be presented every 5 years. So next year, the ministry will need already to take events to start preparation of the next NDC. In her recent presentations, Daniela told us very well what criteria the country should meet to participate in the mechanisms of Article 6. Are there questions from the audience and from online audience? I suggest that we can take one question now and the rest, please send them in writing because we have one more speaker online. Please. Можно я задам вопрос?
Yeah, sure. So I have the following question. According to some environmental experts, they said that COP27 is kind of greenwashing. So I wanted to ask the expert that talked about the COP27, like, does she agree that it was greenwashing?
Well, yes, thank you. I understood the question. It's a little bit of a strong word, but you know, the climate change negotiations are extremely difficult, and they're extremely difficult for several reasons. First of all the decisions are taken by consensus, and you have 198 countries with different political and economic interests, because you know, this convention, this Paris Agreement is more about economics. Yeah. So on top of that, you have a lot of participants, this time 35,000 participants. So it becomes with more than 160 agenda items. So it becomes really complex and really difficult negotiations. And so it's always the results are not the most ambitious. And always the results, I must say, are even below average, unfortunately. Indeed, as Alok Sharma, the COP26 president, said that after Glasgow, 1.5 degrees Celsius goal was still alive, but it has very weak pulse. Now, after Sharm el Sheikh, it's on a life support system. So yes, we can say there was a backslide, but again, a lot of things which are the basic things in the Paris Agreement, the ratchet mechanism of the Paris Agreement is in place. So each time, every 5 years, and even midterm, countries has to present their more ambitious NDCs. And in 2023, next year, there will be the so-called global stock take, where the world will take stock, will make an inventory where we are in achieving the mitigation goal, the adaptation goal, the financial goal, the technology transfer, and the capacity building. So all this will be assessed globally, and together with what the science is telling us, hopefully after that, the next NDCs of the countries will be more ambitious, and we will get closer to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But honestly, as a person attending already for in 24 COPs, I must say that I'll say it in Russian. Спасение утопающих в руках самих утопающих. Потому
That people can save themselves. Those who are drowning, they should save themselves. You are young people. You should take it seriously. You should lobby these interests in the government and take action to cope with climate change, because the international community proved that they were not able, that they didn't have enough time to find the solution of all these climate change consequences. Thank you very much. An additional question. What do you think how this conference was useful, important for Kazakhstan? As of results, what will be the next? What Kazakhstan will work on after this conference?
Well, I'll switch to English. One important thing, of course, is because this is already more about implementation. It's not that much anymore about participation in the negotiations, but more implementing on the ground what the Paris Agreement is asking us to do, because this is an international treaty which you have ratified. Yeah. So in terms of the implementation, you have to focus on preparing on time ambitious NDC, having in place long-term emission development strategy, and under it, even having sectoral strategies, sectoral plans, projects, programs, and so on. And as well, doing the reporting on time. As I said, if you want to benefit from the market-based mechanisms, you have to start preparing for that. Another thing important, which is already coming from Glasgow and confirmed at this conference, this is phasing down unabatable coal subsidies and reducing the usage of coal generally. Your country has signed a declaration which is outside of the negotiations, but still a declaration of the heads of states to increase the forests. And you have to work on this to meet your promise, and again, to report to the international community of your activities in this area. So there is a lot to do. I was recommending some years ago that the Kazakhstan has in place a roadmap to implement the Paris Agreement and the following decisions, with certain timetable, with respective authorities which will be in charge, and to have a monitoring system in place which will show you how you are going with the implementation of the Paris Agreement.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Daniela. This is a long list of things to do. There is also a registry thing that was not resolved in Kazakhstan. Distinguished friends, let's stop asking questions now. Please provide your questions in writing. And we have our last speaker. This is an international consultant, Jeremy Hills. We understand that without the financial mechanism, without financial impact, mitigation and adaptation measures won't be effective. They won't be implemented. So, Jeremy, so could you please take 10 minutes to give us your main ideas? Thank you.